Hello, everyone! Today we bring you a story that resonates like a symphony of sorrow and hope. Join our Inspirational True Stories as we step into this journey together. And don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any updates. The city was a glittering hive of lights and sound, a place where ambition clawed at the heavens and left shadows deep enough to swallow lives whole. Amid this cacophony of success and solitude stood Ethan Sawyer, a man sculpted by discipline, wrapped in wealth, and hollowed by loss. His sharp suits and calculated demeanor had long replaced the boy who once laughed freely, but behind the polished glass walls of his high-rise office, Ethan felt the weight of his isolation more keenly than ever. 20 years had passed since his mother, Emily Sawyer. Tonight was no different. The desk before him was a battlefield of contracts and figures, victories hollow without anyone to share them. Ethan leaned back in his leather chair, the cityscape outside his window a blur of lights that seemed indifferent to his loneliness. His mind drifted, as it often did on late nights, to his mother. She had been his anchor, her laughter a melody that softened the world's harsh edges. Ethan shook his head, banishing the nostalgia. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. His driver had been waiting for hours, but tonight the thought of returning to his sterile penthouse felt unbearable. A sudden impulse struck him. A walk. It had been years since he'd done something so unstructured, so human. The winter air outside bit at his face as Ethan strode down the street, his tailored overcoat doing little to shield him from the chill. He turned into a small park nestled between towering skyscrapers, a patch of green and solitude that had somehow resisted the city's relentless march. The usual hum of the city felt distant here, replaced by the soft rustle of bare branches swaying against the wind. Yet, the silence felt heavy tonight, almost alive, as if the park itself held its breath in anticipation. Ethan's footsteps echoed on the stone path, each step pulling him deeper into an unfamiliar unease. The air seemed colder here, denser, as though the past had settled into the cracks of the stone and refused to let go. He pulled his coat tighter and pressed on until his gaze caught something out of place, a figure huddled on a bench beneath the feeble glow of a lamppost. She was frail, her thin frame swallowed by the tattered coat she clutched against the night's bitterness. Wisps of gray hair escaped the confines of her knit hat, and her hands trembled as they grasped a bundle of something Ethan couldn't see. She looked like a ghost from a bygone era, forgotten and alone, a stark contrast to the gleaming skyscrapers that loomed around the park. He hesitated, an unfamiliar sense of concern prickling at the edges of his carefully guarded composure. Ethan rarely paused for strangers. His world was one of boardrooms and results, where vulnerability was a currency he could ill afford. Yet something about the woman, her quiet desperation perhaps, compelled him to step closer. "Ma'am," he called softly, his voice carrying an unfamiliar gentleness. "Are you all right?" The woman startled, her shoulders jerking up as if she had been caught trespassing. She turned to him, her face lined with the weight of years and sorrow. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she clutched her bundle tighter, a flicker of defiance in her weary eyes. I'm fine," she stammered finally, though her trembling belied her words. Her voice was raspy, barely louder than the wind rustling the trees. Ethan stepped closer, his breath misting in the air. "It's freezing. You can't stay out here like this." "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the ground. Her voice cracked under the weight of those words, as though admitting them was an unbearable defeat. Ethan's jaw tightened. He shrugged off his coat, ignoring her protests as he draped it around her frail shoulders. The fabric engulfed her, its warmth a sharp contrast to the biting cold. "Take it," he said firmly. "You need it more than I do." The woman's eyes welled with tears, her lips trembling as she mouthed a quiet, "Thank you." But there was something more in her expression, a profound sadness, as though she carried a burden too heavy for words. Ethan didn't ask. He nodded and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him in his tracks. "Would have been proud of you," the woman murmured, her words barely audible over the wind. Ethan froze, his heart skipping a beat. He turned back to her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What did you say?" But the woman only shook her head, her gaze distant as though lost in a memory. Ethan wanted to press her, to ask what she meant, but something in her expression silenced him. He walked away, the echo of her words lingering in the air like a ghost. That night, as Ethan lay in his vast empty bed, he couldn't shake the image of the woman or the sadness in her voice. The city outside his window seemed quieter than usual, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. Who was she, and why did her words feel so personal, so familiar? His mind drifted back to his mother, her warmth, her unwavering kindness, and the way she had always believed in him, even when he doubted himself. A pang of guilt twisted in his chest. It had been years since he visited her grave, the memories too painful to confront. But tonight, for the first time in decades, he felt the pull of the past, an irresistible urge to uncover the truth behind the stranger's words. Tomorrow, he resolved, he would visit his mother. Something told him that the frail woman on the bench had stirred more than pity in him. She had stirred the ghosts of a story that had yet to be told. Ethan's morning routine was a well-rehearsed symphony of efficiency. Coffee brewed while his laptop booted up. Notifications chimed as he skimmed emails, and his calendar dictated the tempo of his day. Yet today, none of it seemed to matter. The image of the elderly woman from last night refused to leave him. Her frail frame, the tremor in her voice, and, most haunting of all, her cryptic words clung to his mind like smoke in a clouded room. "She would have been proud of you." The phrase echoed in his thoughts as he stared blankly at the spreadsheet on his monitor. Who was she talking about? His mother? It felt impossible, and yet, how else could those words be interpreted? Ethan's hands hovered over the keyboard before he pushed away from his desk. Work could wait. There was something far more pressing gnawing at him, something he hadn't faced in years. By mid-afternoon, Ethan found himself standing in front of the wrought iron gates of St. Augustine Cemetery. The air was heavy, the overcast sky casting the grounds in muted gray tones. He hadn't been here since his mother's funeral, and the memories it stirred up were unwelcome visitors. He hesitated, his fingers curling around the cold metal gate. What was he hoping to find? Closure? Answers? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that the pull to be here was stronger than his reluctance. With a deep breath, he stepped inside, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Rows of gravestones stretched out before him, each one a testament to lives lived, loved, and lost. He moved slowly, his gaze scanning the markers until he found hers, Emily Sawyer. The name stood out as if etched into his soul. Beneath it, the inscription read, "Beloved Mother and Friend." A lump formed in his throat as he crouched beside the grave, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. How, Mom?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. "It's been too long." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of wind through the nearby trees. Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of 2 decades of unspoken words pressing against his chest, regret mingled with a strange sense of peace, until a sound startled him, a muffled sob. His eyes snapped open and his head turned sharply toward the source. Just a few feet away, a figure knelt by another grave, the elderly woman from the park. Ethan's heart raced as he took in the scene. She was dressed in the same threadbare coat from the night before, though now it seemed even more inadequate against the biting chill. Her frail shoulders shook as she clutched a tissue to her face, her sobs raw and unrestrained. For a moment, Ethan froze. What was she doing here? And why, of all places, did she seem so familiar with this cemetery? The questions bubbled to the surface, but the sight of her grief held him still. He approached cautiously, his footsteps deliberate but soft, as if not to disturb her fragile world. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Ma'am?" The woman startled, her head snapping up. Her tear-streaked face was etched with a pain so deep it seemed to carve lines into her very being. When her eyes met his, recognition flickered, followed by what looked like shame. "You again," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Ethan crouched beside her, his gaze flickering between her and the grave she knelt before. "I saw you last night," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Are you all right?" The woman let out a brittle laugh, the sound breaking like glass. "All right? No, dear, I haven't been all right in a long time." Her words carried a weight that made Ethan's chest tighten. He glanced at the gravestone in front of her. The name Emily Sawyer stared back at him, and the world seemed to tilt. "What are you doing at my mother's grave?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. The woman's expression crumpled. "Your mother," she began, her voice trembling. She paused, as if searching for strength. "Your mother was the only friend I ever had, and I betrayed her." Ethan's breath hitched. The rawness of her admission hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. "Ah, you knew my mother?" he asked, his tone a mixture of disbelief and urgency. The woman nodded slowly, tears slipping down her weathered cheeks. "Emily, she was kind to me when no one else was. She had a light in her that I envied, a strength I admired, but Her voice broke, and she clutched her chest as if the weight of her guilt was suffocating her. "I ruined everything. I destroyed her." Ethan's mind raced, piecing together fragments of a story he didn't know existed. "What do you mean you destroyed her? What did you do?" The woman shook her head, her eyes hollow. "I can't. Not here. Not now. It's too much." "Too much for who?" Ethan pressed, his frustration breaking through his composure. "You come here, crying over her grave, telling me you betrayed her and now you won't explain? Do you have any idea how long I've been trying to understand what happened to her? What really happened?" The woman flinched at his words, her frail form seeming to shrink under his intensity. But then her gaze hardened, and for the first time, Ethan saw a glimmer of defiance. "You think you're ready for the truth?" she asked, her voice steadying. "You think knowing will make it easier? It won't. The truth will tear apart everything you think you know about your family." Ethan stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of questions, anger, and something he couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe. Fear of what he might uncover. "I deserve to know," he said finally, his voice quieter but no less resolute. "If you cared about her, if you truly want to honor her memory, then tell me." The woman's eyes glistened with fresh tears, but she didn't look away. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down like a storm waiting to break. Finally, she nodded. "Not here," she murmured. "Come find me tomorrow at the community shelter on Franklin Avenue. I'll tell you what you need to know." With that, she stood, her frail body trembling under the effort. Ethan watched her walk away, his thoughts a chaotic mess. He turned back to his mother's grave, his fingers brushing the cold stone once more. "I'll find the truth, Mom," he whispered. "I promise." The following day arrived cloaked in a gray, dismal sky, mirroring the heaviness in Ethan's chest. His usual routine felt like a series of empty gestures, each action dragging him further into a fog of unease. The woman's words replayed in his mind like a haunting melody, dissonant and unresolved. "I betrayed her." He had spent the morning convincing himself that he wouldn't go, that he had no obligation to chase answers from a stranger who had stirred up wounds long scarred over. But by afternoon he was on Franklin Avenue, his feet carrying him to the shelter like a man navigating a dream. The shelter was an unassuming building nestled between a laundromat and a convenience store, its peeling paint and faded signs betraying years of wear. Inside, the air smelled of worn fabric and faint antiseptic, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the space. Ethan stepped through the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. It didn't take long to find her. The elderly woman. Mildred, he now knew, sat at a corner table, a steaming mug of tea cradled in her hands. The room seemed to shrink around her, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on her weathered face. The coat he'd given her was draped over the back of her chair, its presence a quiet testament to their shared moment in the park. At the sight of it struck Ethan unexpectedly, the memory of his gesture feeling less like charity and more like armor, a shield against the bitter cold of her existence. He approached cautiously, his footsteps muted on the linoleum floor. Mildred looked up as he neared, her eyes weary but sharp. "You came," she said, her voice devoid of surprise. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat across from her, the scrape of the metal legs against the floor breaking the silence. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on her trembling hands as they clutched the mug. Finally, he spoke. "I need to know what happened. To my mother? To you? To everything?" Mildred sighed, her breath escaping like steam from a broken kettle. "It's a long story," she said, her words tinged with resignation. "And not an easy one." "I have time," Ethan replied, his tone firm. Mildred nodded slowly, setting the mug down. She leaned back in her chair, her frail frame sinking into the worn upholstery. "Your mother, Emily. She was the brightest light in a world that had forgotten how to shine. She had this way of making you feel like you mattered, like you were worth something, even when the world told you otherwise." Her voice faltered, and for a moment she seemed to shrink into herself. "I wasn't always like this," she continued, gesturing to her frail body and the threadbare clothes she wore. "Once, I had a family, a life. Your mother was a part of it, until I destroyed it all." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "How did you know her?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with urgency. Mildred's gaze dropped to her lap, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sweater. "We met when I was working as a housekeeper," she began. "Your father, Richard, hired me to take care of the estate. Emily, she was different from the others in that house. She treated me like a person, not just a pair of hands to clean up after her." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "She trusted me," she whispered, "and I betrayed her." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. Ethan felt his chest tighten, his mind racing with possibilities. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. Mildred looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of guilt and defiance. "I told your father about her plans to leave," she said, "to escape with Henry." Ethan's breath caught. "Henry? Who's Henry?" Mildred hesitated, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. He was her first love, the man she wanted to be with. Your father couldn't stand the thought of losing her, so he used me to stop her. He promised me. He promised to protect my son if I told him everything. What? Her voice broke, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. I thought I was doing the right thing, she said, her voice trembling. I thought I was protecting my family, but all I did was destroy hers. Ethan stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, disbelief, and an ache he couldn't quite name all collided within him. And my mother? He asked, his voice barely audible. What happened to her? Mildred shook her head, her gaze distant. After I told Richard, everything spiraled. He found out about Henry, about their plans to run away. He confronted her. I don't know what he said, but the next thing I knew, she was gone. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening as he fought to contain the storm brewing inside him. She died, he said, his voice flat. In an accident. Mildred's gaze snapped to his, and for a moment, there was something in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or regret. That's what they told you, she said. But it wasn't an accident. Her words hit Ethan like a blow, the air leading his lungs in a rush. What do you mean? He demanded, his voice rising. Mildred flinched but held his gaze. I don't know all the details, she admitted, but I know your father had something to do with it. He couldn't let her leave, not with Henry. Ethan pushed back from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He stood, his chest heaving as he tried to process what he'd just heard. Why are you telling me this now? He asked, his voice raw. Because you deserve to know the truth, Mildred replied, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face, and because I can't carry this guilt anymore. The room seemed to close in around Ethan, the walls pressing against him as the weight of her confession threatened to crush him. He glanced at the coat draped over her chair, its folds a stark contrast to the bleakness of the room. It felt like a symbol now, not just a shield against the cold, but a fragile barrier between the past and the present. I need time, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Mildred nodded, her expression unreadable. Take all the time you need, she said, but don't let the truth die with me. Ethan turned and walked out of the shelter, the weight of her words following him like a shadow. The cold air outside bit at his face, but it felt distant, unimportant. His mind was consumed by one thought. He had to find out what really happened to his mother, and he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. The drive to Lauren's home was unusually quiet, the city's bustling rhythm muted by the weight of Ethan's thoughts. The revelations from Mildred churned in his mind like a storm at sea, each wave bringing fresh doubts and anger. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as the memories of his mother began to resurface, vivid but fragmented, like scattered shards of stained glass. Lauren's townhouse was modest compared to Ethan's sleek penthouse, nestled in a leafy neighborhood that seemed worlds away from the cold steel of corporate ambition. He hadn't seen his sister in years, their relationship strained by time and distance. Yet, as he knocked on her door, the urgency of his need to understand overshadowed the awkwardness between them. The door creaked open, revealing Lauren's surprised face. Her expression softened into concern when she saw his. Ethan, she said, her voice cautious. Is everything okay? No, Ethan admitted, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I need to talk to you. It's about Mom. Half turning, he headed toward the study, fear tightening his steps. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Lauren closed the door behind him, her movements hesitant. What about her? She asked, leading him into the living room. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below after listening to the story and let us know which part of the video you enjoyed the most. Ethan hesitated, his eyes scanning the familiar yet distant room. The walls were lined with photographs of her small family, moments he had missed while burying himself in work. He focused on a framed picture of their mother, her smile frozen in time. It struck him how young she looked, her eyes sparkling with a warmth he could almost feel. Lauren noticed his gaze and followed it, her expression tightening. "You haven't talked about her in years," she said, sitting on the edge of the couch. "What's going on?" Ethan sank into an armchair, the weight of his exhaustion catching up to him. "I met someone," he began, the words tumbling out. "An old woman named Mildred. She said she knew Mom. She said," his voice faltered, the enormity of the truth he was uncovering too much to voice aloud. "She said Mom wanted to leave, that she had a first love. Someone named Henry." Lauren's face went pale, her hands gripping the hem of her sweater. "Henry Salazar," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "You're talking about Henry." Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. "You know about him." Lauren nodded, her gaze dropping to her lap. "I didn't know the whole story, not when we were kids. But after Mom died, I started piecing things together. I didn't want to believe it at first, but there was always something off about the way Dad talked about her. He painted her as unfaithful, weak, but I don't think that's the truth." Ethan's jaw clenched, the image of his father twisting in his mind. "What do you mean?" Lauren took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "After Mom died, I found letters hidden in her jewelry box. They were from Henry. He and Mom, they loved each other before she met Dad. But Dad..." She paused, her voice breaking. He couldn't stand the thought of losing her to someone else. Ethan felt the room tilt, his pulse roaring in his ears. "So he what? Forced her to stay? Manipulated her?" Lauren nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "More than that, Henry was going to take her away. They had a plan, Ethan. They were going to leave together, but someone told Dad, and everything fell apart." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, his mind reeling. He thought back to Mildred, to her confession. "Mildred said it was her," he murmured. "She told Dad about their plans. She said she'd betrayed Mom." Lauren's expression darkened, a mix of anger and sorrow. If that's true, then it makes sense. Dad always had a way of using people, manipulating them. Mildred must have been desperate. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, his anger boiling over. "But it wasn't just about them running away, was it?" he said, his voice trembling. "Mom didn't just die in an accident. There's more, isn't there?" Lauren hesitated, her eyes searching his face. "I think Dad had something to do with it," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I've thought it for years, but I didn't want to believe it. The accident was too convenient, Ethan, too perfectly timed." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on them. Ethan felt a cold fury building in his chest, the kind that only came with betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Lauren flinched but held his gaze. "Because I didn't know how," she said. You shut yourself off after she died. You buried yourself in work and refused to talk about her. I didn't think you wanted to know." Ethan leaned back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He stared at the ceiling, memories of his mother flashing before his eyes. Her laughter, her kindness, the way she used to hum while cooking dinner, and then the memory of her funeral. The cold, unyielding grief that had swallowed him whole. "I have to know the truth," he said finally, his voice steady. "All of it." Lauren nodded, her expression resolute. "Then we need to find Henry," she said. "He's the only one who can tell us what really happened." That night, as Ethan lay in his childhood bed in Lauren's guest room, the memories came unbidden. He remembered the way his mother used to read to him, her voice soothing and melodic. He remembered the way she would stroke his hair when he couldn't sleep, her touch gentle and reassuring. But more than that, he remembered the sadness in her eyes, a sadness he had never understood as a child. In the darkness, Ethan clutched his mother's memory like a lifeline, the warmth of her love battling the cold fury that threatened to consume him. He thought of the coat he had given Mildred, how it had felt like a shield against the harshness of the world. Now he realized he needed a shield of his own, a way to protect himself from the truths he was about to uncover. The past was no longer a distant shadow. It was alive, reaching for him with relentless hands, demanding to be faced, and for the first time in 2 decades, Ethan felt ready to confront it. Ethan stared out of the car window as the city's skyline blurred into the countryside, the buildings giving way to stretches of open land and skeletal trees. The silence inside the car was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts and unasked questions. Lauren sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The GPS directed them towards Santa Elena, a small town tucked away from the world. The name felt foreign, yet oddly significant, as if the place itself held the answers they sought. Ethan couldn't shake the mixture of apprehension and anticipation building inside him. What would they find? Would Henry Salazar still be alive? Would he even remember Emily? The thought of uncovering more truths about his mother was both exhilarating and terrifying. His heart carried the weight of Mildred's confession and Lauren's revelations. Every mile brought him closer to answers, yet the journey felt like stepping deeper into an emotional labyrinth. Santa Elena was a town caught in time, its streets lined with faded storefronts and modest homes. The air carried the faint scent of pine and earth, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of the city. The car rolled to a stop in front of an address Lauren had uncovered. An old farm on the outskirts of town. The place looked abandoned, its fences leaning precariously, and the barn's roof sagging under years of neglect. Ethan stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under his feet. The wind whipped through the open fields, carrying a chill that cut through his coat. He exchanged a glance with Lauren, her expression a mirror of his unease. "This is it," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Let's go." They approached the farmhouse, its faded yellow paint peeling away in long strips. The windows were clouded with grime and the porch creaked under their weight. Ethan raised his hand to knock but hesitated, his knuckles hovering over the wood. A flood of doubt surged through him. Was he ready to face whatever lay behind this door? Before he could second-guess himself, the door creaked open, revealing a man who seemed as weathered as the house itself. Henry Salazar was a frail shadow of the man Ethan had imagined. His hunched frame was wrapped in a woolen cardigan, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the door. His eyes, however, were sharp, piercing gray pools that seemed to study Ethan and Lauren with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice raspy from disuse. Ethan cleared his throat, his words faltering under the weight of the moment. "Are you Henry Salazar?" Henry's brow furrowed, suspicion creeping into his gaze. "Who's asking?" Lauren stepped forward, her tone gentle. "We're Emily Sawyer's children. We need to talk to you about her." The mention of Emily's name seemed to unravel something in Henry. His expression softened, and his eyes flickered with a deep, unspoken sorrow. He stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. "Come in." The farmhouse was as worn inside as it was out. The furniture was sparse, the walls bare except for a few faded photographs. Ethan's eyes were drawn to one frame in particular, a black and white picture of a young woman with a radiant smile. Emily. Henry followed his gaze, his lips curving into a wistful smile. She was beautiful, wasn't she? Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. She was. Henry gestured for them to sit at the kitchen table, its surface scratched and stained with years of use. He settled into a chair opposite them, his hands clasped together as if bracing himself. "I never thought I'd hear her name again," he said, his voice tinged with both sadness and gratitude. "She was the love of my life." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing against them. Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady but urgent. "We need to know the truth, Mr. Salazar. About her, about what happened to her." "Ah," Henry sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I suppose you deserve that much," he said. "Emily and I, we met long before she married Richard. We fell in love, but Richard was, persistent. He was powerful, and he didn't take no for an answer. She married him because she thought it was the only way to protect her family." Henry's voice wavered, and he looked away, his gaze fixed on a distant memory. "But she never stopped loving me. Even after all those years, we still dreamed of being together. When she told me she wanted to leave him, I thought we finally had a chance." Lauren's voice broke the silence, trembling with emotion. "What happened?" Henry's hands tightened into fists, his knuckles white. "Someone betrayed her. Told Richard about our plans. He confronted her, threatened her, but she didn't back down. She was going to leave anyway." Ethan felt his chest tighten, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Mildred," he said, his voice cold. "It was Mildred." Henry's expression darkened, but he nodded. "She was scared. Richard threatened her son. I don't blame her for being desperate, but..." His voice cracked, and he looked away, his shoulders shaking. "It cost Emily everything." Tears burned in Ethan's eyes, but he fought them back. "And the accident? Was it really an accident?" Henry's gaze snapped to Ethan's, his eyes filled with a mix of fury and grief. "No," he said, his voice hard. "Richard planned it. He didn't just want to stop her. He wanted to destroy her. He rammed their car off the road." The words hit Ethan like a blow, leaving him breathless. His mother's death had always been shrouded in mystery, but this was something far darker than he had imagined. His hands shook as he ran them through his hair, the weight of the truth threatening to crush him. Lauren reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. "We'll make this right," she said softly. "We'll make sure everyone knows the truth." Henry looked at them, his expression a mixture of sadness and hope. "She loved you both," he said, "more than anything. She would want you to know that." Ethan swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," he said, his gaze meeting Henry's, "for telling us." As they left the farmhouse, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the fields in a golden glow. The truth had been unearthed, but its weight lingered, a heavy burden they would carry into the next chapter of their journey. The kitchen of the farmhouse grew eerily quiet, the air thick with the weight of Henry's words. Outside, the wind whispered through the barren trees, its mournful song filling the silence that followed his confession. Ethan and Lauren sat motionless, as though the truth itself had turned them to stone. Across the table, Henry's frail hands trembled, not from age, but from the burden of memories too heavy to bear. His voice, raw and unsteady, broke the stillness. "I've relived that day 1,000 times," he began, his gaze fixed on some distant point far beyond the walls of his small, broken home. "Every detail, every word Emily spoke, every decision I made plays on a loop in my mind, but no matter how much I wish it could, none of it ever changes." Ethan leaned forward, his breath shallow, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. "Tell us everything," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, as though raising it might shatter what little strength Henry had left. "We need to know." Henry nodded slowly, his head bowing as though in prayer. "It started with Roberto," he said, his voice laden with grief. "Mildred's boy. He was just a kid, a brave, foolish kid who wanted to help Emily escape. He agreed to drive her to the train station that night." Laura's breath hitched, her hand flying to her mouth. "Roberto," she whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. Henry's eyes closed, his face contorting with anguish. He adored Emily, treated her like an older sister. He thought he was saving her, but... His voice broke and he took a shuddering breath. Richard found out. He followed them. The room seemed to shrink as the weight of Henry's words pressed down on them. Ethan felt his chest tighten, his mind conjuring images of his mother in those final moments, her hope, her fear, her resolve. "I remember the phone call," Henry continued, his voice quieter now, as though he were speaking more to himself than to them. "Emily had just left the house. She called me from a payphone, her voice trembling with excitement. She said she was on her way, that this was it, that we were finally going to be free." Tears welled in his eyes, spilling over as his voice broke again. But then there was a sound, a crash, and then nothing. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening as anger surged through him. "Richard," he said, his voice filled with venom. "He did it. He killed her." Henry nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. "He didn't just stop her," he said, his tone heavy with despair. "He wanted to destroy her, to punish her for choosing love over loyalty to him." Lauren's tears fell freely now, her hands trembling as she reached for Ethan's. "She must have been terrified," she said, her voice barely audible. "She must have known what he was capable of." Oh! Ethan's mind raced, each revelation cutting deeper than the last. His mother's life, her love, her strength, had been stolen not by fate, but by cruelty. "And Roberto?" he asked, his voice strained. "What happened to him?" Henry flinched as though the question itself were a physical blow. He died in the crash," he said, his voice hollow. Richard made sure no one ever questioned it. He had the power, the influence. To everyone else, it was just an accident. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan struggled to process the enormity of it all. The betrayal, the loss, the lies that had shaped his family's history. He felt a sharp pang of guilt, as though he had failed his mother by not uncovering the truth sooner. Henry's voice, now barely a whisper, broke the silence. "I should have been there," he said, his eyes brimming with tears. "I should have protected her. But I was a coward. I let fear keep me away, and because of that, she's gone." His hands covered his face, his frail shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The sight of him, this once strong man now crumbling under the weight of his regret, brought a lump to Ethan's throat. He wanted to comfort him, to tell him it wasn't his fault, but the words felt hollow. How could anyone absolve a grief so profound? Lauren, her voice trembling but firm, spoke up. "You loved her," she said, her gaze fixed on Henry. "You gave her hope when she needed it most. That's not nothing." Henry looked up, his tear-streaked face etched with disbelief. "But it wasn't enough," he said. "Love wasn't enough to save her." Ethan, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him, finally spoke. "It wasn't your fault," he said, his words deliberate. "Richard was the one who took her from us, not you." Henry's eyes searched Ethan's face, as though looking for some semblance of forgiveness. "I wish I could believe that," he said quietly. "But the guilt, it never goes away." For a long moment, the three of them sat in silence, the only sound the faint creak of the farmhouse settling around them. Outside, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. It felt as though time itself had paused, holding them in this fragile moment of shared sorrow. Finally, Ethan stood, his resolve hardening. "We can't change what happened," he said, his voice firm. "But we can make sure the truth doesn't die with us. Mom deserves that much." Lauren nodded, wiping her tears. "And so does Roberto." Henry looked at them both, his expression a mix of gratitude and sadness. "If there's anything I can do to help," he said, his voice trembling, "I'll do it." Ethan placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, the gesture as much for himself as it was for the older man. "You've already helped," he said. "You gave us the truth. Now it's our turn to make it right." As they stepped outside, the cold air stung Ethan's face, but he welcomed it. It felt cleansing, like a sharp reminder of the life that still lay ahead. The past had been unearthed, its secrets raw and painful, but he felt a flicker of hope amidst the sorrow. The road to justice would be long, but for the first time in decades, Ethan felt his mother's presence not as a ghost haunting his memories, but as a light guiding him forward. The dimly lit room at the community shelter seemed to shrink as Ethan stepped inside. Mildred sat at the far corner, her thin frame hunched over a table. The coat he had given her still draped her shoulders, its fabric now a part of her identity, a small shield against the weight of the world. When she looked up, her expression froze. The light caught her sunken eyes, a flicker of recognition sparking in them before giving way to dread. Her hands, gnarled and trembling, clutched the edge of the table as if bracing for what was to come. Ethan crossed the room in measured strides, each step heavy with purpose, until he stood before her. "Mildred," he said, his voice steady but laced with an intensity that made her flinch. "We need to talk." She gestured to the chair across from her, her hand trembling as if the motion itself cost her energy. "I knew this day would come," she said softly, her voice cracking. "Sit. I owe you answers." Ethan lowered himself into the chair, his movements deliberate. He folded his hands on the table, his piercing gaze locked on hers. "You told me you betrayed my mother," he began, his tone controlled but sharp. "You said you destroyed her. I need you to explain. All of it." Mildred's face crumpled, the lines on her skin deepening as tears welled in her eyes. "I don't know where to start," she whispered. "Start with the truth," Ethan said firmly. "It's all I want." Mildred inhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling as though she were preparing for a plunge into icy waters. Her hands twisted the fabric of her coat, the gesture betraying the storm of emotions raging within her. "Emily," she began, her voice trembling. "Your mother, she was the kindest soul I ever met. She treated me like family, even when I didn't deserve it. I was just a housekeeper in your father's home, invisible to most, but not to her. She saw me. She cared." Her voice broke and she looked down at the table, her tears falling onto its scratched surface. But I failed her. I let fear control me, and it cost her everything. Ethan leaned forward, his jaw tight. You told my father about her plans to leave. You handed her over to him. Mildred winced, the words cutting through her like a blade. Yes, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I told him. He threatened my son Roberto, said he'd ruin him, destroy his future. I was desperate. I thought if I just told him, if I just gave him what he wanted, he'd leave Roberto alone. Her hands covered her face, her voice muffled as she sobbed. But I was wrong. He didn't stop there. He went after Emily with a vengeance I didn't think possible. He was so angry, so possessive. He couldn't stand the idea of her choosing someone else. Ethan's fingers dug into the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. So you let him manipulate you, he said, his voice cold. And because of that, my mother is dead. Mildred's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face etched with anguish. You think I don't know that? She cried. You think I don't wake up every night hearing her voice, seeing her face? I've been carrying this guilt for decades, Ethan. It's eaten me alive. Ethan stared at her, his emotions warring within him. Anger, sorrow, and something he couldn't quite name. He wanted to lash out, to make her feel the depth of his pain, but the rawness in her voice, the brokenness in her eyes, made it impossible. She trusted you, he said finally, his voice quieter but no less intense. She thought you were her friend. Mildred nodded, her head bowing under the weight of his words. She did, she said, her voice thick with regret, and I betrayed her trust. I betrayed everything she stood for. But I never wanted her to die. I never wanted any of this. Ethan let out a sharp breath, his anger dissipating into exhaustion. Then why didn't you come forward? He asked. Why didn't you tell someone the truth? Mildred's hands fell to her lap, her shoulders slumping. Because I was a coward, she said, her voice hollow. I thought staying silent would protect Roberto, but he's gone now, and all I have left is this guilt. For a moment, silence enveloped them, the weight of her confession settling in the room like a fog. Ethan studied her, the lines of her face, the tremble in her hands. She looked smaller now, more fragile, as if the truth itself had eroded her from the inside out. Henry forgave you, Ethan said finally, his voice softer. Mildred's eyes widened, surprise flickering across her face. Henry? She asked, her voice shaking. He's alive? Ethan nodded. We found him. He told us everything about their love, their plans to leave, and how it all fell apart. Mildred's tears flowed freely now, her shoulders shaking as she wept. I never thought he'd survive that day, she said. I thought he'd hate me if he ever knew. Doesn't hate you, Ethan said, his tone firm. He understands that you were a victim too, but that doesn't mean you're absolved. You need to own what you did. Mildred nodded slowly, her expression resolute. I will, she said. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Tell me what I can do. Ethan's gaze softened, the anger in his eyes replaced with a quiet determination. There's one thing, he said. We're going to tell the truth. About my father, about what he did, and I need you to help us. Mildred's lips quivered, but she nodded. If it means honoring Emily, she said, her voice steady despite her tears, I'll do it. Ethan stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. This doesn't erase what happened, he said, but it's a start. Mildred looked up at him, her expression a mixture of relief and sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me a chance to make amends." Ethan nodded, his own emotions a storm he couldn't yet name. As he left the shelter, the night air felt lighter, less suffocating. The past couldn't be changed, but the truth could still be brought to light. And that, he realized, was the first step toward healing, for all of them. The morning sun filtered through the canopy of trees surrounding Henry's farmhouse, casting long, dappled shadows across the yard. The world felt hushed, as though holding its breath for the moment to come. Mildred stood by the gate, her frail hands gripping the wooden post for support. Her gaze lingered on the porch where Henry sat, waiting, his figure barely visible in the warm light. Ethan and Lauren flanked her, their presence a silent encouragement. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, his voice low, careful not to break the fragile tension. Mildred didn't respond immediately. Her shoulders rose and fell as she took a deep breath. "Ready?" she whispered, her voice carrying decades of guilt. "No, but it's time." She took a tentative step forward, her cane tapping against the gravel with each stride. Henry remained seated, his posture straight despite the frailty of his age. As Mildred approached, his eyes lifted, catching hers. For a moment, time seemed to stop. "Henry," she said, her voice trembling as she came to a halt a few feet away. Henry's face was unreadable, his sharp eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. The silence stretched between them, thick and impenetrable. Mildred lowered her gaze, unable to withstand the weight of his scrutiny. I thought I'd never see you again," Henry said at last, his voice steady but laced with emotion. Mildred looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. "I didn't think you'd want to," she replied, her words catching in her throat. "After everything I did." Henry stood slowly, his movements deliberate. His hands rested on the porch railing, steadying himself as he descended the steps. "You were scared," he said, his tone softer now. "We were all scared." "But I betrayed her," Mildred said, her voice breaking. "I betrayed you. I betrayed everything she stood for, and I've been running from it ever since." Henry stopped a few feet from her, his gaze softening. "You didn't betray her, Mildred," he said. "Richard betrayed all of us. He twisted our fears, turned us against each other. We were victims of his cruelty, just like Emily." Mildred's tears spilled over, and her cane wobbled as she tried to keep her balance. Ethan stepped forward instinctively, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "I thought I was saving my son," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but instead, I destroyed her." Henry's expression shifted, a mix of sadness and understanding. "You were protecting Roberto," he said. "You thought you were doing what you had to, and maybe Emily would have forgiven you for that." Mildred's breath hitched, her body trembling under the weight of his words. "I don't deserve forgiveness," she said. "Not from you, not from her." Henry took another step forward, his weathered face softening further. "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But forgiveness isn't about deserving it. It's about letting go of the pain that's been holding you prisoner." Mildred's knees buckled, and she collapsed into a chair that Ethan quickly pulled up for her. She buried her face in her hands, her sobs shaking her small frame. "I don't know how to let go," she whispered. Henry crouched beside her, his hands resting on his knees. "Start by accepting that you can't change the past," he said. "What's done is done, but you're here now. You're facing it. That's more than most people ever do." Mildred lifted her face, her tear-streaked eyes locking with his. "How can you be so kind?" she asked. "After everything." Henry offered a faint, bittersweet smile. "Because I loved her," he said, simply. "And I know she wouldn't want us to carry this pain any longer." Mildred reached for his hand, her frail fingers trembling as they wrapped around his. "I'm so sorry, Henry," she said, her voice cracking, "for everything." Henry covered her hand with his own, his grip firm despite the tremor in his fingers. "I know," he said, "and I forgive you." The words hung in the air, a quiet absolution that seemed to lift the weight from both their shoulders. Ethan and Lauren watched in silence, the raw emotion of the moment leaving them humbled. Mildred's sobs quieted and she sat back, her body visibly lighter. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with both gratitude and disbelief. Henry stood, his movements slow but steady. He turned to Ethan and Lauren, his gaze warm. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said, his voice strong. "Both of you, for seeking the truth, for honoring her memory." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, his chest tightening with a mix of sorrow and pride. "We're just trying to do what's right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Henry nodded. That's all she ever wanted. Mildred stood leaning heavily on her cane, her gaze fixed on Henry. "If there's anything I can do to help," she said, her voice steady despite her frailty, "tell me. I owe it to Emily. To all of you." Henry's expression turned thoughtful, his eyes distant for a moment. Then he nodded. "We'll need you when we tell the world the truth," he said. "Your voice matters, Mildred. It always did." Mildred smiled faintly, her face lined with both sorrow and fragile hope. "Then I'll be there," she said, "for Emily." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, its warmth chasing away the morning chill, the four of them stood together in the quiet yard, bound by a shared purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, but in this moment, there was a sense of peace, a promise of healing. For the first time in decades, Mildred felt a sliver of freedom, a faint glimmer of redemption. And for Ethan and Lauren, the reunion was a step toward justice, a chance to honor their mother's legacy and finally lay the past to rest. The Sawyer mansion, once a symbol of power and opulence, now stood as a silent witness to the unraveling of its darkest secrets. The grand hall was filled with an uneasy mix of tension and anticipation. Ethan and Lauren stood at the center, their faces stern and resolute, while a small gathering of close friends, family, and longtime employees filled the space. The air buzzed with whispers, the guests exchanging curious glances as they waited for the announcement. At the far end of the room, Mildred sat in the shadows, her frail hands clutching her cane. Her presence was barely acknowledged by the crowd, though Ethan and Lauren had made it clear that she was an integral part of what was to come. Next to her, Henry Salazar leaned against the wall, his eyes scanning the room with quiet vigilance. Ethan stepped forward, his commanding presence silencing the murmurs. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "Today we're not just here to honor my mother's memory. We're here to tell her story. The truth." A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Richard Sawyer's name had long been synonymous with respectability, his death leaving behind a legacy that few dared to question. Ethan's words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. "What truth?" someone muttered, their voice breaking the silence. Lauren stepped beside Ethan, her gaze sweeping across the room. "For years, we believed that our mother, Emily Sawyer, died in a tragic accident," she said, her voice trembling with controlled emotion. "But that's not the whole story. What we're about to share will change everything you thought you knew about our family." The murmurs grew louder, skepticism and curiosity mingling in equal measure. Ethan raised a hand, commanding silence once more. "Before we continue, there's someone you need to hear from," he said, turning toward Mildred. All eyes shifted to the elderly woman, who seemed to shrink under their scrutiny. Ethan nodded to her, his expression firm but encouraging. Mildred took a deep breath, her hands gripping the cane tightly as she pushed herself to her feet. The room fell into a tense hush. "My name is Mildred Hayes," she began, her voice wavering but growing stronger with each word. "Many of you may not remember me, but I was a housekeeper here in the Sawyer mansion for many years, and I have a confession to make." The crowd leaned in, their curiosity sharpening. Mildred's gaze darted to Ethan and Lauren, who gave her subtle nods of reassurance. "I betrayed Emily Sawyer," Mildred said, her voice breaking. "I betrayed her trust, her friendship, and everything she stood for, and that betrayal led to her death." Gasps erupted from the room, the tension escalating. Ethan stepped forward again, his voice cutting through the noise. "Let her finish," he said sharply, his tone brooking no argument. Mildred's hands trembled, but she pressed on. "Emily loved someone else, a man named Henry Salazar," she continued, her words coming faster now, as though releasing years of pent-up guilt. "She wanted to leave Richard, to escape his control. She confided in me, and I told Richard everything." Another round of gasps swept through the crowd. Mildred's knees buckled slightly, but Henry stepped forward, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. The simple gesture gave her the strength to continue. "Richard used my fear against me," Mildred said, her voice cracking. "He threatened my son, Roberto, and I thought if I told him what he wanted to know, it would protect my family, but it didn't. Instead, it cost Emily her life." The room was deathly silent, the weight of her confession sinking in. Ethan took the opportunity to step forward again, his voice carrying the strength of his conviction. "My father didn't just stop her from leaving," he said. "He orchestrated the so-called accident that took her life. He rammed their car off the road, killing not just my mother, but Roberto as well." Shock rippled through the crowd, faces turning pale as the full extent of Richard's actions came to light. Lauren stepped beside Ethan, her voice filled with emotion. "Our father's obsession with control and power destroyed everything. He manipulated everyone around him to maintain his facade, even at the expense of the people he claimed to love." A voice broke through the crowd. "How can you be sure of this?" an older man asked, his face lined with doubt. Henry stepped forward, his presence commanding attention despite his frail frame. "Because I was there," he said, his voice steady. "Emily and I planned to leave together. I waited for her that night, but she never came. Instead, I got the call, the crash." Henry's eyes swept the room, his gaze piercing. Richard's power silenced the truth for years, but it's time for everyone to know what really happened. Emily didn't die because of bad luck or an accident. She died because Richard couldn't stand to lose control. The crowd erupted into a cacophony of voices, disbelief and anger filling the room. Ethan raised his hand again, silencing them. "We're not here to destroy our father's legacy," he said firmly. "We're here to honor our mother's. She deserves to be remembered for the strength, courage, and love that defined her, not the lies that overshadowed her." Lauren stepped forward, her voice shaking with emotion. "That's why we've decided to create the Emily Sawyer Foundation," she said. "A foundation dedicated to helping women escape abusive relationships and reclaim their lives, just as she tried to do." The announcement was met with murmurs of approval, the crowd slowly shifting from shock to understanding. Mildred, her face streaked with tears, stepped forward one last time. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I've done," she said, "and I hope this foundation will be a part of that." The room fell silent once more, the weight of the moment sinking in. Ethan glanced at Lauren, their shared determination unspoken but palpable. Together, they had unveiled the truth, shattering the lies that had haunted their family for decades. As the crowd began to disperse, Ethan stood tall, his voice ringing out one last time. "The truth isn't always easy to face," he said, "but it's the only way to heal. This is just the beginning, for our family and for Emily's legacy." The room, once filled with tension and disbelief, now held a quiet sense of resolve. The truth had been revealed, and with it came the promise of justice, redemption, and perhaps peace. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the Sawyer estate in hues of gold and crimson, as if the house itself was finally exhaling after decades of suffocating secrets. The once oppressive silence in the grand hall had softened, replaced with a gentle hum of purpose. The remaining guests had departed, leaving behind only those who had borne the weight of the revelations: Ethan, Lauren, Mildred, and Henry. The four sat together in the drawing room, its high windows bathing them in the warm glow of the setting sun. For the first time in years, the space didn't feel cavernous or cold. Instead, it felt intimate, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. Mildred was the first to break the silence, her voice soft and hesitant. "I never thought I'd see this day," she said, her eyes fixed on her trembling hands. "To stand in this house again and speak the truth. For so long, I thought it would die with me." Ethan leaned forward in his chair, his elbows resting on his knees. "It almost did," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But you did the right thing. You gave my mother back her voice." Mildred looked up, her eyes glistening. "It doesn't erase what I did," she whispered, "but it's a start, and for that, I'm grateful." Henry, seated beside her, nodded in agreement. "None of us can change the past," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "But Emily's story doesn't end with her death. It lives on, in this foundation, in the truth, and in both of you." Lauren smiled faintly, her hand resting on Ethan's arm. "It feels like we're finally doing something good," she said. "For her, for us, and for everyone she would have wanted to help." Ethan looked at his sister, his expression softening. "It's more than that," he said. "It's about healing, for all of us." Mildred shifted in her seat, her fingers tracing the edge of her cane. "I've been thinking about Roberto," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "He would have been so proud to see this, to see what Emily's legacy is becoming." Henry placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "Roberto was brave," he said. "He gave his life trying to help her, and now his sacrifice means something." The room fell into a comfortable silence, each person lost in their thoughts. The weight of the day's events lingered, but it was no longer oppressive. Instead, it felt like the kind of heaviness that comes from letting go, a bittersweet release. Later, as the sky deepened to twilight, Ethan and Lauren walked through the estate's garden. The air was cool and fragrant with the scent of blooming jasmine, and the faint chirp of crickets filled the quiet. They moved slowly, their steps unhurried, as though savoring the moment. Lauren glanced at her brother, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked. "If Mom had left with Henry? If Dad hadn't?" Ethan sighed, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "All the time," he admitted. "But then I think about what Henry said. We can't change the past, All we can do is decide what we do with the truth now." Lauren nodded, her eyes misting. "It's just hard to let go of the what-ifs, you know?" Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her. "I know," he said, his voice gentle, "but holding on to them won't bring her back. And it won't bring us peace." Lauren looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right," she said. "It's just going to take time." Back in the house, Mildred and Henry sat by the fire in the drawing room, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. Mildred's voice was low as she spoke, her words tinged with a vulnerability that came only with age. "I've carried this guilt for so long," she said, her gaze fixed on the fire. "It's strange to feel it lifting now. It's like I can finally breathe." Henry nodded, his expression contemplative. "Forgiveness does that," he said. "Not just forgiving others, but forgiving yourself." Mildred glanced at him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You've always been better at that than me." Henry chuckled softly, the sound warm and familiar. "I've had more practice," he said. "Living alone all these years gives a man a lot of time to think." Mildred's smile faltered, and she looked down at her hands. "Do you think Emily forgave me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Probably intentionally, she tried to say the tenderful, lost words in her head. Henry didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for her hand, his touch steady and reassuring. "If she were here," he said finally, "I think she'd tell you what she always told me, that love is stronger than anger, and that she'd want us to move forward, not stay stuck in the past." Mildred's tears spilled over and she squeezed his hand tightly. "Thank you," and she said, her voice choked with emotion, "for not giving up on me." Henry's smile was soft, his eyes glistening. "Ah, Emily wouldn't let me," he said, "and neither will I." As the night deepened, Ethan, Lauren, Mildred, and Henry gathered one last time in the grand hall. The air felt lighter now, the tension that had once gripped the house replaced with a quiet sense of resolve. Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the small group. "Tomorrow, the foundation launches," he said. "It's the first step toward something bigger, something meaningful, and none of it would have been possible without all of you." Lauren placed a hand on his shoulder, her smile radiant despite the tears in her eyes. "This is for Mom," she said, "for everything she stood for." Mildred nodded, her frailty overshadowed by the strength in her gaze. "And for all the women like her," she said, "who deserve a chance to be free." Henry, his voice quiet but firm, added, "It's about justice and finally giving Emily the legacy she deserved." The four of them stood together, their bond forged through pain and truth, and now hope. The Sawyer family's story had been rewritten, not one of power and control, but one of resilience, redemption, and love. And as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, they knew that, for the first time in decades, Emily Sawyer's spirit could finally rest. The Sawyer estate was quiet now, the halls emptied of the voices that had once reverberated with tension. The air held a stillness that seemed almost sacred, as though the house itself was exhaling after the weight of the truth had finally been laid bare. Ethan stood alone in the drawing room, gazing out of the tall windows at the darkened garden. The stars were faint tonight, obscured by the clouds that gathered like silent witnesses above. Lauren's soft footsteps broke the silence. She entered the room, her face tired but calm, carrying 2 steaming mugs. "I figured you could use this," she said, handing one to Ethan. He accepted it with a faint smile, his fingers curling around the warm ceramic. "Thanks," he murmured, taking a sip of the chamomile tea. Its gentle aroma reminded him of quieter nights, long before the truth of their family's past had come to light. Lauren settled into the armchair beside him, curling her legs under her. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft. "How this house feels different now. Like it's finally lighter." Ethan nodded, his gaze still fixed on the garden. "It is," he said. "But there's still so much to process, so much to rebuild." Lauren studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever really move on from this?" she asked. "Or will it always be there, like a shadow?" Ethan turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the weight of his thoughts. "I think it'll always be there," he admitted. "But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's a reminder, not of the pain, but of the strength it took to face it." Lauren smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "You've changed, you know," she said, her voice tinged with affection. "The Ethan I knew years ago would have buried himself in work and ignored all of this." Ethan chuckled softly, the sound tinged with irony. "I guess losing everything has a way of making you reevaluate what matters," he said. "Mom always told us to be brave, didn't she? To stand up for what's right, no matter the cost." Lauren's smile grew, her eyes misting. "She'd be so proud of you," she said. "Of us." Ethan's throat tightened at her words, and he looked away, his gaze falling to the mug in his hands. "I hope so," he said, his voice quiet. "For the longest time, I felt like I let her down, like I should have seen it, should have done something to stop it." Lauren reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "You were a kid, Ethan," she said gently. "You couldn't have known. None of us could have." He looked at her, his jaw tightening as he fought back the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "But I'm not a kid anymore," he said. "And now that I know the truth, I won't let her legacy be forgotten. Not again." In the next room, Mildred and Henry sat by the fireplace, its embers glowing faintly in the dim light. The crackling of the woods was the only sound for a time, a soothing rhythm that seemed to fill the spaces between their words. Mildred broke the silence, her voice hesitant. "Do you think she'd forgive me?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Henry turned to her, his expression soft. "I think Emily's heart was big enough to forgive anyone," he said. "She saw the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves." Mildred sighed, her hands clutching her cane. "I spent so many years hating myself," she said, "and now that it's all out in the open, I don't know what to do with the guilt." Henry leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't let it define you," he said. "You do what Emily would have done. You turn it into something good, something that helps others." Mildred looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Oh, you make it sound so simple," she said. "It's not," Henry admitted, "but it's worth it." The two sat in silence again, the weight of their shared memories settling between them like an old familiar friend. For the first time in decades, Mildred felt a glimmer of peace, fragile but real. Ethan and Lauren rejoined them as the night deepened. The four of them sat together, the quiet camaraderie of shared purpose binding them. The foundation, the truth, the new beginnings. It all felt so fragile, but it was a start. "I was thinking," Lauren said, breaking the silence, "about the Foundation's first project. We should dedicate it to Mom and Roberto. Their story is what started all of this." Mildred's lips trembled and she nodded. That would mean so much, she said. To both of them. Ethan smiled faintly, the idea settling in his mind like a warm light. It's perfect, he said. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered. Henry's voice, steady and thoughtful, added, It's not just about remembering, it's about making sure no one else has to go through what they did. The group fell silent again, the firelight casting long shadows on the walls. For the first time, those shadows felt less ominous, less like reminders of the past, and more like gentle echoes, fading but never forgotten. As the clock struck midnight, Ethan rose, his movements deliberate. He walked to the mantel above the fireplace, where a photograph of Emily now stood, her smile radiant and timeless. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the frame. We did it, Mom, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. We finally told your story. Lauren joined him, her hand resting on his shoulder. And we'll keep telling it, she said, as long as it takes. The night deepened, but the atmosphere was no longer heavy with secrets. Instead, it held a quiet hope, a promise that, though the wounds of the past might never fully heal, they could still lead to something beautiful, something worthy of Emily Sawyer's memory. Our channel brings you this story to highlight that through truth, love, and courage, we can overcome the shadows of the past and build a brighter future. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We sincerely appreciate your support and look forward to seeing you in the next story.